Hey, it's Dr. Nate coming to you live from Tenoshka Hall on campus of SDSU. So you're going to hear a lot of car noise behind me and birds and who knows what other crazy things. So excuse that, but it's a wonderful view, right? We're going to be talking about women and challenges in media. It is the last section of this module. So we're really going to focus on culture and feminist theory. So I really have to give you a couple of definitions first before we move forward. So what is culture? Usually the first thing that we think about when we think about culture is being kind of refined and cultivated, right? You're cultured if you know different types of music, different types of art, different types of cuisine, right? But culture can mean much, much more. People might also think about these sacred types of elements of society, like religious artifacts, different types of vases, different types of pottery and murals that we associate with different cultures. But it can also mean the everyday, ordinary, mundane, the way people conduct their life day to day, right? What is the culture of San Diego? What is the culture of San Diego State? And then, of course, that's very micro. We spoke about this in a couple of modules ago. But then we can also go very macro, right? So what is the culture of the United States compared to the culture of Russia? What's the culture of the East compared to the culture of the West, North to South? These types of things as well, too. Culture is always about shared meaning. How do we, as human beings, as individuals, assign different types of meaning to different types of things? And that is usually going to happen through interaction with them. And then these different types of meanings are then passed down from generation to generation. It's passed down from families to children, from different types of leaders in the community, right? They could be religious leaders, politicians. They could also be teachers and librarians, right, that keep this different type of culture going and help us understand what it is. But culture can be any of these different things, and that's what we're going to tackle for the rest of the semester, is looking at how different types of cultures not only produce content, but how do they interpret content. And to do that, we're going to use a theory called symbolic interactionism. Now, I have put a link to the video specifically talking about Mead and Bloomer's conceptualization of symbolic interactionism in your Blackboard. So I want you to watch that. It's a 3-minute video. I want you to watch that as well as the other videos after you finish this one. So symbolic interactionism, what is it on a nutshell? Well, it means that action and the way in which we interact with each other and the way in which we interact with objects and different types of phenomenon is dependent upon the meaning that we have for those different types of objects and phenomenons. And of course, different people, different cultures are going to assign different meanings to things. So we can think about what a specific type of phenomenon or symbol means. We can think about just a cow, right? What does a cow mean? For people in some parts of India, a cow is sacred. You don't touch it, right? You don't definitely eat it. You treat it with respect. In the United States, when you look at a cow, you think of beef, you think of food, substance, right? And so that simple object has completely different meaning to two different cultures, right? And then when we interact with one another and start to share the different ways in which meaning is created, we can start to understand how other cultures might come to understand this specific object, and how can we be better at not just understanding, but providing different types of interactions that aren't that are culturally sensitive and not as offensive as well, too, right? We can think of a cross. What does a cross mean to something, to different types of people? If you're a Christian, it might mean faith, it might mean Jesus Christ, it might mean Christianity as a whole. If you're an interior decorator who really is maybe not as religious, it could just mean something that is pretty, something that matches the color scheme or decor of your house. If you're agnostic or atheist, it might just mean a sign of something that you don't align with, right? It's the opposite of your belief. And then if you've been somebody who's been hurt or harmed by Christianity, then it can mean oppression. It could mean a very negative type of symbol. So again, the way in which we assign meaning to different types of objects, different types of phenomenon, is different depending on us. That meaning can also change, right? Back and forth. Different words that we used back then, we don't use now, right? At one time, it was politically correct and completely socially acceptable to use the N-word. Now we don't, because we know exactly what that means, and we've tried to educate people. Well, I should say now we don't. Majority of people don't, because there's still some hating ass people out there who are racist and still use it. But for the majority of people, we don't use that word because we know the meaning that comes behind it, right? But then people who are Black African American sometimes use that word spelled differently, pronounced differently, as a source of empowerment, as a source of reclamation, but they only use it amongst themselves. Nobody else really uses that either. So again, the way in which we assign different types of meaning to words, to phenomena, to objects, is specific to culture, specific to interaction and action, and can change, right? Depending on time, depending on interaction with certain people, and so forth. So we're really going to look at that. I also want to tell you the definition we're going to use for culture. Looking back at the definitions we talked about at the beginning of this presentation and symbolic interactionism, the definition we're going to use for the class is a system of shared meanings embodied in social practices, social relationships, and socially meaningful objects. Remember, socially keeps coming up here because it's all about symbolic interactionism, how we interact with one another and how we use that interaction to assign meaning to certain things. And that, of course, is very important for the media industry because we're looking at how people assign meaning to the content they create and how people assign meaning to the content they consume and view. So the culture industry, just in broad terms, is mass media, right? The way in which we look at different types of commercialization and corporations that actually create the content that we view and listen to in terms of media. There's two parts to that. That's the production part and there's the reception part. Again, think symbolic interactionism, right? The meaning behind all of this. So production is the process of actually creating the different content and then distributing it. Reception is the audience's part, right? And that's broken up also into two different parts, consumption and interpretation. So how does the audience consume this material? Are they watching it on television? Are they watching it in the movie theater? Are they watching it on their phone? Are they accessing it via the internet or physically going, like to the movie theater? And then there's the interpretation part, which is, again, really, really important to take symbolic interactionism and marry it with this. How is the audience interpreting the content that they are watching, that they are listening, right? So there's the consumption part, but then there's also the interpretation part that happens. And it's really important when we look at symbolic interactionism because people that are producers will produce content based on their culture, based on how they assign meaning to something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the audience is going to interpret it in that same way. Stuart Hall calls this encoding and decoding, right? Producers encode something and then the audiences will decode it into a certain way. And of course, we've heard this, I say of course a lot, don't I? We can think of this kind of old adage that meaning is lost in translation, right? And that could mean that maybe different cultures, different languages, different ages and generations, different parts of the world, we see that there are ways in which media content is encoded and then people will decode it completely different. And that could happen for a variety of reasons. That could mean that the people producing it aren't aware of how it's going to be interpreted by different cultures. It could mean that they're really trying to produce something in a very specific light and culture, but don't do it properly, or maybe the editing process happens and then of course it's choppy. The season finale of Game of Thrones, right? I feel like there was just a lot of choppiness happening and we got from point A to point Z without knowing the points in between. Anyway, I digress. But it's important here specifically when we're speaking about women because most of the people that are in power and in control of creating content are men. White, cisgender, westernized men. And they're producing content from their perspective, which means women may not interpret it the same way. Different types of minority groups will not interpret it the same way. In fact, they might interpret it a completely different way that may come off as offensive, right? So the producers really sometimes are not cognizant of the content they're producing and how it affects other people specifically. I want to go through a couple of different charts that were taken from the Hollywood Diversity Report. This was published by UCLA back in 2018. It does a really good job at looking at a very narrow definition of diversity, which is gender in terms of cisgender men and women, no trans, and race ethnicity. That's it. Doesn't look at sexual orientation, doesn't look at disability or ability, doesn't look at socioeconomic status, it doesn't look at all these different things, right? Ability and disability. But it's what we have, so we're going to do it. So I'm going to move through these rather quickly. This right here is looking at the number of cisgender men compared to cisgender women that are the role of writers in top theatrical films. From 2011 to 2016, as we can see across the board from 2011 to 2016, disproportionate amount of men writers than there are women. If we look specifically at directors, again, the gap is even bigger. There is a huge amount of male directors from 2011 to 2016 compared to female directors. 6.9 females, 93.1% males. When we look at actors and actresses, right, who are the lead characters in these top theatrical films? Again, majority men than there are women. The gap is not as pronounced in terms of writing and directing, but it's still pretty big. These are leads by gender in terms of broadcast scripted, and this is really looking at broadcast network television. We can see at one time there were more female leads than there were males, but that has changed and inverted, and now we see 35.7% of the leads in broadcast are women, or 64.3% of the leads are men. Now we look at specifically cable scripted shows. We see that this gap is a lot less pronounced. All the way in 2015 and 2016, 55.2% men, 44.8% women. And if we keep going, maybe in the next couple of years, if the trend continues, we will see that gap eventually close. What about digital scripted shows, right? These are shows that come out on Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime. We can see that the gap again is starting to close at a quicker rate, 56.9% men, 43.1% women. In terms of considering a little bit of intersectionality, looking at gender and looking at race and ethnicity, we can see that there is still a disproportionate amount of white men that are film actors, right, than there are of any other race. In fact, the lowest intersectionality here is going to be Native American women, only 3. That's it, out of all of the sample taken from 2011 all the way to 2016. The number is huge. 3 Native American women compared to 668 white men. Yeah. Here we look at the same type of intersectionality, but this time we're looking at actors and actresses in broadcast scripted and in cable scripted. As we can see, almost 0 Native American women, not almost, there are 0 Native American men and women in broadcast scripted, and only 3 Native American men and and 0 women in terms of actors and actresses in cable scripted shows. Still disproportionate amount of white men. But we can also look at the other different types of intersectionalities, right? Black, Latino, Asian, and then they cut it off at mixed. In terms of this report, we can see those are still disproportionately lower in terms of representation as well. Digital scripted, we see the gap is not as pronounced as the other things that we viewed before, but we see that it still exists. Native Americans still not being represented in any type of media across the board, and individuals who are of mixed ethnicity and race, individuals who are Asian, Latino, and Black, still low representation across the board on digitally scripted films as well too. So now let's talk about the culture industry, and those of you who've taken my classes before may have seen this a bit because I do a lot of stuff on identity. That's the stuff I teach, that's the stuff I research. But identity, there are a few key things you need to know about identity, right? Identity is how we identify ourselves, how we identify with other people. There can be a personal identity, and there can also be a social identity, right? And how we define ourselves in terms of the groups, the collectivities that we associate with. And that can be social identity based on race, ethnicity. It could be based on gender. It could be based on regional location. It could be based on like school, like SDSU, right? We're all Aztecs. It could be based on a majority of, or a variety of different types of things, right? So identity is personal, it's also social, and it's always going to be interactional, right? The way we act around one person is going to be different how we act around another person or a group of people. Symbolic interactionism, right? All coming together. Identity is ubiquitous. It's all around us. We cannot escape it. It's central to political issues, especially now post 2016, right? We're really starting to see how identity is playing out in the terms of politics, right? Because we use identity a lot to talk about specific groups of people, right? Migrants, LGBTQ people, women, Republicans, Democrats, right? Identity is always central. Identity is always structural. It isn't something that exists in a vacuum. When we look specifically at how women have been treated over the course of time, we look now in 2019, but we also see that it's systemic, it's structural, things that happen over historical periods of time, but also things that happen in micro levels and macro levels, right? These are structured ways of oppression, especially if we look at it in terms of intersectionality. Identity is an economic principle. It's all about money, right? Identity is a cultural principle. It creates these value systems: what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, what's culturally and socially acceptable, and what's not. Identity is also performed. How do we perform? How do we know how to be a man, how to be a woman? How do we know how to be Mexican, Latino, white, Russian, right? All of these things are scripted and institutionalized and very much have these value judgments on the correct way, the traditional way. So when we look at the way in which women are presented, usually it is in very stereotypical roles, very traditional type of gender roles. Women should do this, men should do that. How do you perform this type of identity? How do you dress? How do you act? What do you say? What do you not say, right? In the next module, we're going to be looking at masculinity specifically and how men are supposed to perform, right? How are they supposed to behave? And then, of course, a reminder on intersectionality. Again, it examines this inequality, this inequity in terms of privilege, with focus on connections among the systems of hierarchy, right? Looking at race, class, gender specifically, but also taking into account all these other different types of oppressions that happen as well. Then here's a definition of privilege for you: the benefit of being situated at the top of a social hierarchy, often taken for granted and not noticed by those who actually have the privilege. I speak about white privilege a lot, and I do have to give this caveat right now that when I speak of white privilege, it doesn't necessarily mean that being white is bad. No, it means that being white puts you at the top of the social hierarchy, and the system that has been created and fostered, not just in terms of the media, but just in terms of society, right, and culture, has privileged those individuals who are white and male, right? Male privilege is a real thing too. So it's not about saying that if you're white or male you're bad. It's about saying to recognize that you have a certain amount of privilege. And how do we take white from being at the top and put it into a category like everything else, right? So that white doesn't become the baseline or the thing that people should value and be, but just a category like everything else. Men should also be not at the top of the hierarchy, but again, embedded within this categorical view of things. So it's not that being white or male is bad, it's that there is a specific privilege that comes along with it. We need to recognize it and take it from being the baseline and the hallmark and put it as a regular category like everything else. That's what it's about. So now let's look at feminist theory, right? When people think feminist theory, they're like, oh my God, they're a bunch of men haters. No, I'm a feminist. A lot of people in the class are feminists. Feminist theory just means that you value people and everyone should be equal and the same, and that we should look at the way in which women have been repressed and oppressed and disadvantaged and find a way to restore the equilibrium of history and society and culture, right? So what does feminist theory do? It shifts the assumptions, the analytical lens, the topical focus away from the male viewpoint, right? Again, looking at how males are the dominant power holder and producer of different types of media content, and experience it and point it towards that of women, right? How do we get women more involved in the production and more involved in representation in terms of the content? It also shines a light on social problems, trends, and issues that are sometimes overlooked and maybe misidentified by the historically dominant male perspective within our social theory, but also our society at large. The key areas of feminist theory really focus to include discrimination and exclusion on the basis of sex and gender, objectification, structural and economic equality, power, oppression, gender roles, stereotyping, and a variety of other things. Now, we've already looked at a couple of different examples in class that have shown this inequity in terms of media, and we're going to go a little bit further. Feminist theory also considers how systems of power and oppression interact together, which means that it does not just focus on gendered power and oppression, but on how it might intersect with systemic racism, hierarchical class system, sexuality, nationality, ability, disability, amongst all these other things, right? So feminist theory really considers not just sex and gender, but all these different types of oppression, right? Looking at, again, intersectionality. Intersectionality is part of feminist theory. Queer theory, part of feminist theory. Looking at this greater marginalized, oppressive ways of being, and how can we make it better? Many people sometimes incorrectly believe that if you study feminist theory, or if you are a feminist, right, that you really focus exclusively on girls and women, and that the inherent goal of feminist theory is to promote the superiority of women over men. Not true at all. Again, it's taking this very heavily male-dominated lens and male perspective and including women amongst all of these different types of perspectives as well. In reality, feminist theory has always been about viewing the social world in a way that illuminates the forces that create and support inequality, oppression, injustice, and in doing so, promotes the pursuit of equality and justice. And as I mentioned before, queer theory is part of feminist theory, and of course, power is central to this. We talk about power a lot in this class. I've also placed 3 different feminist videos from YouTube on Blackboard. We'll look at those here in just a second, that I want you to look at, and it takes a look at feminist theory through a variety of different lenses, right? So that you're getting a variety of opinions on feminist theory as well too. There's many different types of feminists, and as academics and scholars have started working on feminist theory, they've kind of branched out into what has been classified into 4 main broad areas of feminist theory: cultural feminists, existential and phenomenological feminists, socialist feminists, and gender feminists. I'm not going to go over these individually. You can look at the video that I placed on Blackboard by Crossman that really looks at these 4 different broad categories and get that information, because I think they do a better job at explaining it than I do. Feminist theory has also kind of been incorporated not just in academia, but also in very practical, pragmatic situations. We looked at different types of social media movements that have happened here in the past couple of years, specifically post 2016, where we're really looking at how women have been treated, mistreated, oppressed, and disadvantaged in society as a whole. When we look at media specifically, there has been specific social media movements that look at what is happening in terms of media production, who has the power in Hollywood and who doesn't, like Me Too, Time's Up. And then, of course, that has spilled over to create broader movements that really have impacted the entire country and nation and world, such as How Will I Change, Women's March, and Here We Are. Those are a couple of the different hashtags that are also talked about in the videos posted on your Blackboard. This is also a video that is on the Blackboard. I'm not going to show it here for you, but I do want you to look at how different types of adults react to the Golden Globes back in 2017. Well, it was hosted in 2018, but it was over the films that have been released in 2017 and TV shows, and really how people reacted to the different types of speeches that were being made by women at the Golden Globes, specifically Oprah's, right? Hers is at the very end.